Lord God, help me get through this. Okay, now we come to the Gospel of Luke. Now, if you have been following along here, and you know we started out talking about the synoptics and the synoptic problem, all those different things, and then we went from Mark, which was first, and then to Matthew, but then we skipped Luke and went to John, and now we're coming back. That may seem a little weird. There's a reason for that. The reason is, when we talk about Luke, we often talk about not just Luke, but Luke Acts. It's very clear that these are written by the same person. And so it's customary just kind of talk to them as one kind of unified thing. You can see this with the work of Richard Tannehill, the narrative unity of Luke Acts, how this is really encompasses kind of one overarching story coming through there. So that's how we're going to deal with it. Luke and Acts. So when we get to the Gospel of Luke, there are a couple of things we can tell about him. So who is this person that we now ascribe to Luke? How do we know? Well, a couple of things we can tell about them, about this person. So we turn to Luke chapter 1. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile an account of the things accomplished among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the Lord, it seemed fitting for me as well, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, to write out to you in consecutive order, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the truth about the things you have been taught. A couple of things that stand out there is clear that Luke has done his research, but also that he is not an eyewitness of the Gospels. He is not an apostle. He is what would be a second generation Christian, not in terms of like age, but in terms of genealogy. So he would be someone who is converted by someone who knew Jesus there. And so there we go. Now, the most important evidence we really get about how this all comes about is really from the book of Acts and what are known as the we passages. If you look at the book of Acts, there are a couple of times where the narrator shifts from the third person to the first person plural. We did this. So it shows that this person was traveling with Paul at certain points. And when we look at the traveling companions of Paul, there are only a handful of people who are identified by name in Paul's letters. And one of the places we can look for this is Colossians chapter 1. Or Colossians chapter 4 and verse 10. Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner. Barnabas' cousin Mark. Also Jesus, who is called Justus, verse 11. And then we get verse 12 talking about Epaphras. And then we read in verse 14, Luke, the beloved physician, sends you his greeting, and also Demas. So we have a number of people mentioned there, a number of people who are those who are traveling companions with Paul who would fit in that category. Now, when we look at the external evidence, things outside of the text here, we find a couple of things that kind of help us here. Marcion, again, a heretic, but one who does recognize albeit highly edited version of Luke, identifies this to Luke. So we have a second century attestation to the fact that this was Luke here mentioned in Colossians 4. Justin Martyr says that Luke writes memoirs of Jesus and was a companion of Paul. The Muratorian canon goes there. Irenaeus comes there. In fact, he says Luke, a doctor and a traveling companion for Paul. Tertullian, again, characterized the gospel as a summary of Paul's gospel. The oldest manuscripts we have of Luke, again, the Botimer Papyrus, P75, that date around the end of the second century, somewhere between 175 and 225 AD, ascribes this to Luke. So there's a large body of second and early third century eyewitnesses here that are telling us this person was Luke. Now again, these are all traditions; they could be wrong. But one of the things that we do find, it's unlikely that this book or that any of the Gospels ever circulated widely without a name attached to them. Right? There's no sense in which once these start to circulate and they're also collected, they're almost always have some name attached to them, even a prescript or something like that. Also, we understand that there's no one in the early church who debates Lucan authorship. It's always just sort of assumed that it's Luke there. So it would be it's hard to understand why other names would have been put on it if they weren't there from the beginning, right? So we have pretty good reason and pretty good evidence that this is Luke, the traveling companion of Paul, who's also a doctor. Now, we'll talk about date. And part of the dating for the Gospel of Luke is wrapped up with the dating of the book of Acts. So Acts 28 kind of ends with Paul in jail, doesn't recount his release and subsequent travel. We can wonder why. You can have debates about this. The easiest explanation is that's where they are physically in the timeline, with Paul still under house arrest. So we're talking the upper date for the book of Acts would be somewhere around AD 62. So that would kind of put us there, because also Acts makes no mention of the Neronian persecutions that would come later, etc. So the most probable reading for that is that Paul was actually released after that, and he goes out and he goes through in chapter. He goes, some church history puts him in Spain and other things. We'll talk about that in the book of Acts. But that means if this is when the book of Acts is written, the book of Luke is going to have to come before him. So this is where we're going to have to be. I'm going to say sometime, late in the 50, late in the 59, early into 60, maybe even 60, 61, depending on how efficient Luke can be in this. We just don't know. And so sometime around that's as good as we can get there. Now, Luke is unique because he identifies a person to whom he's writing. He says it is written to Theophilus. Now, whether this is a pen name because it's Theophilus, Theo means God, Philos, love, so lover of God there. We don't know if that's a pseudonym for someone or if it's an actual name. It seems it could be certainly a name itself. But we just don't know for sure. One of the things that we do see is that he is referred to as Cratiste, which would mean most excellent. And so that may apply some kind of rank, potentially a Roman aristocrat there that Luke is writing this for. Now, one of the things that's interesting about that is this person probably would have some means if there's a commissioning of these works, right? This is an expensive task that he's undertaking, so that would make sense. Now, while it's addressed to an individual, we should expect that Luke had a broader audience in mind, probably those primarily of a Gentile background. And so this work was expected to go, to continue to expand beyond there. Now, Luke, structure-wise, he doesn't do things that Mark and Matthew do. His is again, more chronologically ordered in there. So we get a prologue. We talk about the birth of Jesus and John, chapters 1 and 2. Chapter 3 and 4, we're talking about his preparation for ministry. Chapters 4 through 950 there, we're talking about his ministry in Galilee. And then from 951 to 1944, it's this journey to Jerusalem. And in 1945 to 2138 is really his time in Jerusalem there, culminating with the end, that from 22:1 on to the end, we're talking about the crucifixion and the resurrection. A lot simpler. There's not the kind of embedded things that you see in Mark and in Matthew. Now, there are some key themes that emerge from the Gospel of Luke. And as we look at them, there are a couple that we want to just see that is unique for him in a way that it is not. So, one of them, it's what's known as Jesus. We'll just call it Jesus and the plan of God. Okay, Jesus and the plan of God. Something that happens a lot we'll see in Luke's Gospel is this word, day. Day. It is necessary. Now, there's a word in and of itself. It's not unique to Luke. We see this in Matthew and Mark, but one of the things that is how it shows up in regards to Jesus' action and his self-understanding for his mission. So that is a key concept. And wrapped up in that is also this idea of salvation history. All right, salvation history. Now, this gets taken a couple of ways. The way we don't want to take it is the way Hans Conzelmann looks at Luke. Hans Conzelmann looks at Luke and says, the impetus or the kind of the driving force behind Luke writing his gospel was the delay of the parousia, the fact that he did not come back immediately. And so when Jesus didn't come back, people were disheartened. And so Luke writes this gospel here, and the way he does it explains not that we should have expected that, but that rather that Jesus is the center of time. Really, now that time is broken up. There's Israel, there's the church, and Jesus stands at the middle of it. And the reason Conzelmann does that again is to say, well, it's just to explain why didn't Jesus come back? Everybody expected him back in the first century. The problem with Conzelmann's thing is this he has this kind of presumptive idea that they were all expecting it there. But that really doesn't work. If you start pulling on this thing sort of starts falling apart. Right? We have no indication that the early church expected Jesus to return quickly, immediately, within even their lifetime there, and that they were disheartened. In fact, in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, we're going to see people who are confused about the coming of Christ. But their confusion is about why hadn't he returned, but their confusion is actually, did we miss it? Additionally, 2 Peter addresses the supposed delay, pointing out, hey, look, that any delay is actually God's grace to the people, allowing them time to repent. So the idea that there's this delay that was disheartening to believers just appears to be an overreading of that. Now, that doesn't mean Conzelmann's fully wrong, because the way that Luke writes this gospel, Jesus is the center of time. In fact, he'll even coin this die Mitte der Zeit, the center of time. The ministry, the crucifixion, death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus is the center of time. And that does fit, again, not for the reason Conzelmann wants to say, but that really does fit. Salvation history has all been leading toward Jesus and then going from him. We'll see how that plays out there. Now, so this is when we understand salvation history, what we're saying, and what I think the better understanding is that Luke is not looking through the lens of time, but ultimately looking through the lens of God's salvific, his redemptive salvation purposes culminated in Jesus. So it all leads here and goes away from there. And the key text, where we really we can pull down a lot of places there. One of the things you can do, you can look at places like this, let's start at the kind of big one that kind of helps us focus this at the end of Luke's gospel in Luke chapter 24. Jesus is here. He's with two disciples on the road to Emmaus. And he says that they recount to Jesus the things that have happened in Jerusalem. And he says, O foolish men, verse 25, and slow of heart to believe in all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary for the Christ to suffer these things and to enter into his glory? Right? So it was necessary. But on top of that, he says, then beginning with Moses and with all the prophets, he explained to them the things concerning himself in all the scriptures. So we get this big picture of Jesus saying, all of this has been leading up to me, and now he goes on from here. We get a similar thing here in verse 44. Now he said to them, these are my words which I spoke to you while I was still with you, that all things which are written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled. Then he opened their minds to understand the Scriptures. And he said to them, thus it is written that the Christ would suffer and rise again on the third day, and that repentance for the forgiveness of sins would be proclaimed in his name to all the nations, beginning from Jerusalem. Again, this big picture. The Old Testament, he does something unique here. We've seen this a little before, but the Old Testament is all pointing forward to Jesus, to the cross. This is the point of it. It is all leading to this, and from here, we're going to the nations. So this plan of God, it all is culminating in the work of Christ and then leading on to the nations, going on from there. Now, you can see this played out and kind of built into the Gospel of Luke. You can look at Luke 4:43. He says that we must preach the good news of the kingdom in many cities there. He says, kind of predicts about himself, look, is it not written that a prophet is without, that he would not die here, because it's inconceivable that a prophet would perish outside in Jerusalem. He says he must stay in Zacchaeus' house. He says the cross is necessary in 9:22, 17:25, 22:37, and 24:7. So a lot of this, one of the things that we're seeing is this way of understanding that God's plan and purposes are all fulfilled in Jesus in the redemption of humanity. And it's not that theme is absent in Matthew or Mark or John. It's that it's brought out in a unique way in the Gospel of Luke. The second theme here is Luke gives us the theme of salvation. Again, this is necessarily tied to our first theme, the outworking of God's plan. Now, Luke is the only synoptic gospel to use the word salvation, or the word soter, soteria, soterion. You see it in 169, 71, 77, 230, 36, and 99. We see the word soter in 147, 211, and sozo, to save. And sozo gets used, this word to save gets used more in this book than in any other book of the New Testament. Now, again, partially because of its length. All right, it's a longer book, right? Paul doesn't have anything that comes within about 8 chapters of length of Luke's gospel, so that does play into it. But one of the things we see is that this salvation, it's about providing forgiveness for sins. We see that in 177, 5:17 through 26, 7:48 through 50, 19, 1 through 10, 24, 46 through 47. And one of the things that he's highlighting here is this particular outlook that will be crucial for how the church understands its mission. That Jesus Christ has saved us. He has saved us in this sense of forgiveness. And this is the center of the gospel that they will be proclaiming, particularly as this transcends Jewish ethnic boundaries and goes into goes to the Gentiles in this. Excuse me. And one more theme here that really gets here. It's this theme of the outsiders. You may see it's called the outsiders, the downcast, however you want to put it there. One of the things that we find here is that Luke focuses on those who are outside of the social acceptable spectrum. You see this actually starting back in Mary's song there, the Magnificat there. It highlights a significant portion of highlights God's care for the lowly, there. And so it's considerable attention on the poor, 146 through 55 and 418 as well. Also considerable attention on sinners. Again, those who do not abide by the Pharisaical rituals. So you see this 527, 728 and 30, 736 through 50, 15:1 and 2, 19:7. A number of places this shows up. We also get an emphasis on the Gentiles. One of the things that's interesting is that in Luke's genealogy, Luke goes all the way back to Adam, whereas Matthew goes back to Abraham in the genealogy. Luke will go all the way back to Adam, highlighting the universal significance of Jesus' life and ministry to those who are outside, again, of this kind of four walls of Judaism there, right? So it's a huge emphasis because it's going to be a huge emphasis, again, in the book of Acts. And so Luke is kind of priming the pump there for us as he's dealing with this, and he's looking forward to it. So it's a great picture for us. It's one of those times we can sit there and see, all right, this is what's going on, those who are outside there. We also see this theme of the Gentiles coming in chapter 4, verses 25 through 27. He reminds the people of Nazareth that God showed his grace to the widow at Zarephath. Again, that would be a non-Jew. As well as to Naaman the Syrian. In 7:1 through 10, he actually commends a Gentile centurion's faith. He doesn't commend the Jewish people and their faith. Chapter 10 and chapter 17, right? One of the big ones there. The Samaritan is the hero for one of the most famous stories there. That's a huge one. And so one of the ways this plays out, this idea with outsiders and salvation, particularly, comes in Luke 15. Now we all know this. This particularly pertains to the prodigal son, as we often call it. Now, what's interesting about the way this plays out in Luke chapter 15 is it's not just one parable. It's actually what are known as three nesting parables together. So if you look at Luke 15, the reason it starts off, it says, now all the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to him to listen to him. Both the Pharisees and the scribes began to grumble, saying, this man receives sinners and eats with them. So we get a couple of parables here. The first is the parable of the lost sheep. Right? He leaves the 99 and seeks after the one. And there's a pattern. Seeking, it is found, and then there's rejoicing. Then we get the parable of the lost coin. Right? She seeks the house, she finds the coin, and there's rejoicing. And then the final one, we'll call it the parable of the lost son. The son is lost, goes out. We all know this part, wayside, and he's come back, and yet the father is looking. He is, in some sense, seeking. He finds him, and he calls him to this place, and there is rejoicing. So we get this this pattern repeated again. But it goes on. It goes on one more time. Because then we have the older brother coming home, and this older brother is indignant at this lost son. Excuse me. And he's throwing a temper tantrum out in the field, and everybody's kind of like, dude. But the father goes to him and invites him in. He's seeking his older son that comes out, and then this is where the cycle stops. It does not continue or complete the cycle, because the older son then represents the Pharisees and the scribes, while the sinners, those who are outside, are coming into salvation. Here we have this offer made out to these religious leaders, and then they're not embracing it. They're not embracing salvation. So ironically, they are the ones on the outside. So a very interesting set of things that come in with the Gospel of Luke. Excuse me. As you deal with that. Excuse me. a unique picture into God's plan and God's purposes of salvation to all people, even to those who are outside, who are not part of the traditional, here are the good people. No, God reaches out to sinners and to tax collectors, those who are broken, and redeems them through His Son.